I'd like to introduce David Moskowitz, the head of government relations and public policy for Wells Fargo, to introduce the presentation.
Thank you. And this is the grand finale of the book festival. I think one of the things we've learned is that reading and literacy really impact everything. They impact our personal development, they impact the economy, they impact the environment that we're in. And since, I think, 2001, thousands of people have come to the Library of Congress National Book Festival for an opportunity to hear from some of the greatest literary minds of our time, and the opportunity to see the depth of the imaginative brains of all of these wonderful authors, and we're going to hear from one shortly. I'm David Moskowitz. I'm head of government relations and public policy at Wells Fargo. I'm really happy to be here. We've been committed to the DC area since 1914. That's 106 years, partnering with community lenders and organizations to improve lives and strengthen the communities that we work with. That includes the National Book Festival. This is the 9th year that we've been a charter sponsor. We can see what this festival does and what the Library of Congress does to nurture the enthusiasm for reading and the related growth of our opportunities. In 2018, Wells Fargo team members read to 106,000 children and donated more than 58,000 books through our Reading First program. We really put our money where our mouth is on this. And I really hope that while you were here today, you had a chance to visit our booth downstairs and see some of the fun activities that we put together, which are really intended to do one thing, which is to help make reading fun and ignite the desire to read. So now to why we're here. I'm honored to bring to the microphone Manuel Roig-Franzia, who's a writer for the Washington Post Style section. He will introduce this evening's speaker, Rick Atkinson, who will discuss the first book in his Revolution Trilogy, The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. And having read The British Are Coming, as well as Rick's award-winning Liberation Trilogy, I can say it was a thrilling, cinematic, and mind-opening experience about the birth of our country and the sacrifices that were made by these patriots. And so with that, Manuel.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to introduce you to Rick Atkinson. So some of you may know Rick Atkinson from his deep reporting at the Washington Post when he was there, and certainly many of you know him from his trilogy of excellent books about World War II. But before all that, before the front page stories, before the accolades and the bestseller lists, Rick Atkinson was a 20-something reporter at a newspaper that no longer exists, the Kansas City Times. And in 1982, Rick Atkinson was awarded the highest award in journalism, the Pulitzer Prize. And I looked it up, and this is what the Pulitzer Committee said: for the uniform excellence of his reporting and writing on stories of national import. And what jumped out at me there was the plural, stories. Not just one story that he spent all year working on, but multiple stories about multiple topics. One was about the chaotic management of water resources in the country, but then a completely different topic, an examination of the U.S. Officer Corps that focused on a group of graduates from West Point. And so I guess when I looked at that, it made a lot of sense to me that one of our foremost chroniclers of World War II would now be turning his attention, his voice, the power of his research to a completely different conflict that matters so much in our history. And with that, I would ask you to welcome Rick Atkinson to the stage.
Thanks for that, Manuel. Good evening. Apologies to those of you who are here looking for McCullough. You missed him by an hour. We're going to turn out the lights here tonight on the 2019 National Book Festival. and it's been great as usual. I live here in Washington, and the National Book Festival is my favorite event in our town because it assembles the components that make reading a miracle. Authors, editors, publishers, readers, and of course, books. A book festival, like a library or a great museum, can serve as a time machine. It can transport us to distant eras and faraway places, and we'll use this setting to do exactly that for a few minutes this evening, traveling to a place and time of bitter partisan rancor, uncertainty about the present, deep anxiety about the future, and savage political discord. And no, we're not going to Capitol Hill. The last time I was here, I had finished a 3-volume, 750,000-word narrative about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II, a project that took me 15 years. And even before that third and final volume was published, I was pondering what to do next. And I kept thinking of Jack London's advice that rather than sit back and wait for inspiration, an author ought to light out after it with a club. And the obvious thing for me would have been to pivot to the Pacific and do for that campaign what I had done for the campaigns in the Mediterranean and the European, Western European theaters, but that would have required me to start World War II all over again at Pearl Harbor or even earlier, and that didn't have much appeal. And besides, I couldn't shake a fascination that I've had with an earlier century and a different war. So I took my club and I set out after it. So I've now completed the first volume in what I hope, knock wood, will be another trilogy. The British Are Comin' opens with a long prologue in June 1773 when King George III, our last king, travels to Portsmouth on the southern coast of England for a 4-day review of the Royal Navy. It's a fantastic, proud display of military muscle, precisely a decade after the creation of the first British Empire, with Britain's great victory over France and Spain in the 7 Years' War. We call it the French and Indian War. 1773 is the year the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was coined. And this volume ends with the battles at Trenton and Princeton in early 1777, which together resuscitated American hopes that had seemed all but extinguished. Well, perhaps we can agree that there is a lot to dislike about the Founding Fathers and the war they waged for American independence. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves. That's 1 in 5 of all souls in the 13 colonies when those fine words were written in 1776. Nor was it valid for Native Americans, for women, or indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American Revolution, those who remained loyal to the British Crown, and even fence straddlers who were uncertain about the wisdom of armed rebellion against their monarch, were subject to dreadful treatment: public shaming, disenfranchisement, confiscation, beatings, torture, exile, and execution. Some were imprisoned on Hudson River scows anchored below Albany, or in an old Connecticut copper mine where they were lowered by windlass 70 feet below ground to rock-walled cells known simply as hell. Partisan belligerence metastasized into civil war. John Adams later said, "I would have hanged my own brother had he taken part with our enemy in the struggle." Conformity, censorship, and zealotry flourished. In a defensive war waged for liberty and basic human rights, the Americans promptly invaded Canada in an attempt to win by force of arms what could not be won by blandishment and negotiation, a 14th colony. This was the first, but hardly the last, American invasion of another land on the pretext of bettering life for the invaded. The enduring image of a yeoman farmer leaving his plow in the furrow to grab a musket and go off in defense of liberty is mostly mythical. During the Revolution, General George Washington's army was rarely larger than 20,000 soldiers, and sometimes as small as 3,000, this in a country of 2.5 million. Particularly after the initial martial enthusiasms aroused at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had begun to fade in 1775, relatively few American men volunteered for military service, especially if it involved enlisting for the duration in the badly armed, badly led, badly clothed, badly fed American Continental Army. And yet, who would deny that the creation story of our founding remains valid, vivid, and thrilling? Even in 2019, at a moment when national unity is elusive, when our partisan rancor seems ever more toxic, when the simple concept of truth is assailed, the story informs who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and perhaps the most profound question any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for. Indeed, at least 25,000 of them, 25,000 Americans, died for the cause, and perhaps many more. It's a larger proportion of our population to die in any of our wars other than the Civil War. So, what can we learn from that ancient quarrel? First, that this nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. Second, that there are foundational truths that not only are indeed true, but are, as the Declaration of Independence tells us, self-evident. Third, that leaders worthy of our enduring admiration rise to the occasion with acumen, grit, wisdom, and grace. And fourth, that whatever trials beset us today, we have overcome greater perils, existential perils, before. That should be of great comfort. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation after many subsequent struggles. It includes strictures on how to divide power and to keep it from concentrating in the hands of those who think primarily of themselves. We cannot let that heritage slip away. We cannot allow it to be taken away. We cannot be oblivious to this priceless gift or the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives over the past 243 years to affirm and sustain it. Now, the American Revolution was not a war between regimes or dynasties fought for territory or the usual commercial advantages, but rather an improvised struggle between two peoples of a common heritage who had been gradually sundered by divergent values and conflicting visions of what the world could become. The Americans eventually won by embracing fewer strategic misconceptions than the British did. Certainly, the rebels could be wrong-headed in believing, for example, that they had greater economic leverage over the mother country than they actually possessed, for example, or in caricaturing George III, who sat on his throne for 60 years and was shrewder, more complex, and more admirable than the overbearing ninny who still dominates our imaginations and even tonight somewhere is mincing across the stage in Hamilton. Yet George and his ministers made three critical miscalculations. One, that most colonists remain loyal to the crown, notwithstanding troublemakers in New England capable of rousing a rabble. Two, that firmness, including military firepower, would intimidate the obstreperous and restore harmony. And three, that failure to reassert London's authority in America would eventually unstitch that newly created British Empire, encouraging insurrections in Ireland, Canada, the Sugar Islands in the West Indies, India. It's an 18th century version of the domino theory that would propel America into Vietnam 2 centuries later. Britain also underestimated the difficulty of waging a protracted war across 3,000 miles of ocean in the age of sail, for 8 years, as it turned out. Expeditionary warfare, whether waged in North America in the 18th century or in Central Asia in the 21st century, is among the hardest of all martial enterprises. The British Army in the Revolution, unable to gather food and forage from the American countryside without being ambushed, relied largely on provisions shipped from England and Irish ports. But, for example, of 40 supply and transport ships dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775, only 8 of those 40 reached the King's forces directly in Boston. The rest were blown by gales back to Britain, or blown by gales to the West Indies, or intercepted by rebel marauders. Of 550 Lincolnshire sheep carried aboard ships that actually made it to Boston, that breed was deemed the fittest to undergo the rigors of that voyage. Only 40 of those 550 sheep arrived alive. 290 hogs shipped, just 74 survived the trip. Most of the 5,200 barrels of flour in one shipment proved to be rancid. When the British moved to New York in the summer of 1776, and they requested 950 horses in order to pull their artillery wagons and their supply wagons, of the 950 horses that were in fact shipped from Britain, 412 died during the voyage. Hundreds more were ruined beyond use when they actually arrived in America. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Logistics is always hard in war. I've personally seen just how difficult it is in Somalia and Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Even when the American rebels were fighting on their home turf, they faced enormous difficulties. Of 75 official letters that General Washington wrote in January and February of 1776, half mentioned munition shortages, often in pleading, fretful terms, particularly about shortages of gunpowder, which he just called the thing. It's difficult to make musket balls without lead. And by the summer of 1776, the Americans were desperately short of the stuff. In New York, more than 100 tons of lead weights from fishing nets and clocks and window sash cords were collected to make bullets, along with lead from downspouts and window glass cames and pewter dishes. Without salt, armies and navies couldn't stockpile the meat and fish needed to move anywhere. 2 bushels of salt, more than 100 pounds, are needed to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. Before the war, Americans imported about 15 million bushels of salt annually, half from the West Indies and half from Britain and Southern Europe. The British trade embargo, when the shooting started, strangled 2/3 of those imports. And to encourage salt works along the coast, including the coast of Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, pamphlets were printed with salt-making recipes. All the old women and children are going down to the Jersey shore to make salt, John Adams wrote. But 400 gallons of seawater are needed to boil off a single bushel of salt, and that takes huge stockpiles of firewood. Virginia, let's pick on Virginia for a minute. They spent more than 6,000 pounds, a huge sum of money in those days, to build evaporation ponds along the Chesapeake Bay. They collected only 50 bushels, probably the most expensive salt in the history of salt. Yet those problems, substantial as they were, hardly matched Britain's problems. The 1,000 tons of bread required each month to feed British soldiers in New York often arrived from depots in Cork, moldy and infested with Irish rats. And there's no rat as nasty as an Irish rat. And those rats soon infested British storehouses on Staten Island. For the winter of 1776-77, the British needed 64,000 cords of firewood, 70 tons of candles, the daily allowance of a gill of rum for each redcoat. A gill was 5 ounces. It's about a gallon a month, which gives you an idea of inebriation problems in the British Army. That supply of rum took an enormous amount of shipping space, 400 transports and victualling ships to move and supply the large force in New York, including to carry the rum. That's triple the tonnage they used in the 7 Years' War. Well, let me talk for a minute about George, our last king. I know Andrew Roberts, who was up here before me, is working on a book about him. I beat him to it. Well, he's an intriguing adversary. Queen Elizabeth II only recently opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owns as part of a project to catalog and digitize the papers from all 4 Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are 350,000 pages, mostly from the reign of George III, most of them previously unpublished. And I was among the first allowed to take a look for a whole month in April 2016 at Windsor Castle, where the papers are kept, just west of London. And every morning I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate to get into the castle, and then show my badge at the Norman gate, and I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers, in gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind. And he wrote not only most of his correspondence himself, he also made the copies. And as you paw through these pages, there's a tactile sense of being in his presence. Among other things, he's a great list maker. Lists of British garrisons abroad from 1764 to 1775. Of Royal Navy vessels under construction in various shipyards, of all his regiments in America, with the number of officers, musicians, and rank and file for each tabulated with arithmetic scratchings in the margins as he did his sums. George copied out his own recipes for cough syrup: rosemary, rice, vinegar, brown sugar, all boiled in silver. And insecticide: wormwood, vinegar, lime, swine's fat, quicksilver. He was interested in everything from music and astronomy to horology, the study of time, and the use of manures in agronomy. He was known as Farmer George. He'd married an obscure, drab German princess, Charlotte, as in Charlottesville, Virginia, Charlotte, North Carolina. She learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord during her voyage to England from Germany. They married 6 hours after they met, and he had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish, because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. The happy union proved fertile. She produced children with lunar regularity, 15 eventually. And we see in his personal correspondence that George is a caring father. He's invested in the rearing of his kids. And through all this, he's trying to figure out the proper course for the British Empire, for the monarchy, and for his people. He's easy enough to dislike, but impossible, I find, to detest or simply dismiss as a reactionary autocrat. The war he chooses to wage, and he is driving the train. That war is brutal, bloody, and often savage. Unlike modern war, killing in the 18th century is usually intimate, at very close range, often with a bayonet. And that's partly because 18th century muskets were mostly inaccurate beyond 50 or 60 yards and mostly hopeless beyond 100 yards. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington, Concord, and in the British retreat to Boston on the first day of the war, April 19, 1775, the Americans fired at least 75,000 rounds, but only one bullet in every 300 actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard around the world probably missed. On the other hand, massed musket fire by clusters of men firing in volleys, sending swarms of 1-ounce lead slugs downrange at perhaps 1,000 feet a second, that could be devastating. A man 5 feet 8 inches tall had an exterior surface of 2,550 inches, of which 1,000 was exposed to gunfire when he was facing an enemy frontally at close range. Given the primitive inadequacy of 18th century medicine, which is hardly worthy of the name, if you're hit in the torso, you have more than a 50% chance of dying. If you're hit in the head, your chances of survival are even smaller. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those in muted blues and grays. Duh. American marksmen, especially those few with rifles, which were more accurate than muskets but harder to load and couldn't carry a bayonet, those marksmen learned to target the brightest of the red coats, those that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes that made those coats pop. It was like wearing a sign on your back that said, "Shoot me." The Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, the British captured roughly a square mile of rebel-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. The British are coming is not something that Paul Revere called while galloping through the Middlesex countryside in the very early morning of April 19th, 1775. That wouldn't have made sense to people who still at that moment considered themselves to be British citizens. What he's quoted as shouting over and over again is "the regulars are coming out," meaning the regular British Army coming out of Boston. But I use "the British are coming" as a metaphor, as a title, because it is a metaphor for what those first couple years of the war are about. The British are coming relentlessly, with most of their ferocious professional army, with nearly half of the greatest navy the world has ever seen, with 30,000 German mercenaries, Hessians, and they're coming to kill your men, rape your women, plunder your homes, and in some cases, burn your town to ashes. It's a dire thing. Well, those are some of the nuts and bolts of 18th century warfare, but what are the emotional guts of the revolution? That's what still moves us, stirs our pride, makes us feel that those men and women of a dozen generations ago have something to say to us. Why is that? Certainly that revolutionary generation can seem so distant as to seem almost a foreign people. If irony and skepticism are the twin lenses of modern consciousness, the revolutionaries often seem archaic. They're much less ironic and skeptical than their latter-day counterparts. They speak English, but they have their own argot and their own idiom, their own slang. For example, passing counterfeit money, widely practiced in the 18th century, was known as shoving the queer. Someone who died took heaven by the way. British soldiers in Boston, by the way, sometimes called the Americans derisively Jonathans. But those are minor differences. We rightly admire those Americans for their endurance, their pertinacity, their sacrifice, not only displayed by men serving in the ranks, but by others swept up in those fraught events, the fraught events of those times. Lois Peters of Connecticut hadn't seen her husband, Captain Nathan Peters, in months when she wrote him, "Pray come home as soon as possible. A visit from you at any time would be agreeable." Meanwhile, she would harvest the corn, sell their oxen for enough cash to keep the family's saddlery solvent, Sew him a shirt and take great pleasure doing it, she wrote him, and keep faith with the future. She signed her letter, that letter and all of her letters, your loving wife until dead. General Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker anchorsmith from Rhode Island, makes one of the worst operational decisions of the war by leaving 3,000 American troops exposed and vulnerable at Fort Washington in Manhattan, where in the space of 8 hours on November 16th, 1776, they're trapped and killed or captured. This is a period when American generalship is often characterized by miscalculation, misfortune, imprudence, and deficient military skills. But Greene picks himself up, takes a deep breath, and writes to Cati, his wife, the virtue of the Americans is put to a trial. I'm hearty and well, despite all the fatigues and hardships. Be of good courage. Don't be distressed. All things will turn out for the best. Be of good courage. He's speaking to us, to you and to you. He's certainly speaking to me. Well, if the central figures in our creation story have frequently been embalmed and reverenced, they nonetheless remain beguiling. They're worthy of perpetual scrutiny and often of emulation. Washington is a case in point. Yes, he owned more than 300 slaves when he died at Mount Vernon in 1799. You cannot square that circle morally. He demonstrated shortcomings as a tactical commander at Long Island, Fort Washington, and on other battlefields. The man who proverbially could never tell a lie sure could prevaricate. Washington's carping about his troops, his officers, and his lot in life, I distrust everything, he grumbled in 1776, transforms the demigod into a sometimes petulant mortal. Yet great responsibility enlarges him. He rightly embodies the sacrifice of personal interest to a greater good, as well as other Republican virtues, Republican small r. Probity, dignity, moral stamina, incorruptibility, traits that should remain true north for every citizen today, traits that we should demand in our leaders. Lesser personalities, largely lost to history, speak to Americans in the 21st century of constancy and an antique patriotism. Heaven only knows what may be my fate, Captain John McPherson wrote in a last letter to his father before being killed at Quebec. I experience no reluctance in this cause to venture a life which I consider is only lent to be used when my country demands it. Likewise, Lieutenant Samuel Cooper wrote his wife, the dangers we are to encounter I know not, but it shall never be said to my children, your father was a coward. He too was killed at Quebec. Some years ago, the distinguished historian John Shai wrote that the Civil War, like every other major event in American history, including the Second World War, has a tragic, human, two-sided quality that the Revolution seems to lack. The whole complex of revolutionary events takes on a smooth, self-contained character that makes getting the right emotional grip on the subject very difficult. My premise is that tragedy is the bedrock of every war because every war is about young men and now sometimes young women dying young. So we see Lieutenant Edward Hull, a young Scottish officer in the 43rd Regiment of Foot, shot at North Bridge in Concord, then shot again during the British retreat toward Boston, captured by the Americans, in agony from 3 bullet wounds, sucking on an orange donated by a compassionate rebel. He lingers for nearly 2 weeks in a twilight of pain and remorse before he too takes heaven, by the way. Or we see Île Noire, the island of nuts, a couple hundred acres in the Richelieu River just above the New York border, where thousands of American soldiers retreating from Canada in June 1776 jammed a malarial hell, half of them suffering from smallpox, dysentery, typhus, or some other god-awful malady, infested with lice and maggots. One doctor wrote, "We had nothing to give them. It broke my heart, and I wept until I had not more power to weep." We see Matthew Patton, of Bedford, New Hampshire, whose son John had survived a gunshot wound to the arm at Bunker Hill, but did not survive Illinois. Mr. Patton wrote simply in his diary, "I got an account of my John's death of the smallpox at Canada. He was 24 years and 31 days old." Historian Bruce Catton considered the American Civil War a redemptive tragedy. Surely the same can be said of the American Revolution. It embodied the enduring aspirations of an idealistic people and brought forth a nation abounding with a sense of destiny. No wonder the world was agog. "The cause of America," wrote the essayist Thomas Paine, "is the cause of all mankind." Even now, the war for independence offers clues to our national temperament. It remains a bright mirror in which we see traits that fashion the American character, from ingenuity and resilience to brutality and pugnacity. We've come far in almost 2.5 centuries in power, diversity, tolerance, and sheer scale. But in some respects, those ancestors remain nearer than we know. Their existential struggle churned up issues that perplex us to this day, including individual liberty versus collective security, the proper limits on executive power, the obligations of citizenship, and the elusive quest for a more equitable society. The tacit primal question of 1776 persists in 2019. Who do we want to be? Democracy is never a thing done. The poet and librarian of Congress, Archibald MacLeish, told us. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing. Even Jefferson's Declaration, our foundational secular scripture, we hold these truths to be self-evident, is a dynamic thing, never a thing done, something a nation must be doing. The great Yale historian Edmund Morgan wrote that the creed of equality did not give men and women equality, but invited them to claim it, invited them not to know their place and keep it, but to seek and demand a better place. The American Revolution lasted 3,089 days. The result was epical and enduring, the creation of the American Republic, one of mankind's greatest achievements. Nearly 90,000 more days have elapsed since those horsefly-swatting men writing the Declaration of Independence asserted a human birthright of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Keeping faith with those who fought, suffered, and died for the principles we profess to still cherish requires more than a nodding acquaintance with them, more than a perfunctory acknowledgement of their struggles. For better and for worse, their story is our story. Their fight remains our fight. Thanks very much for coming this evening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for that. If you have questions or comments, we've got microphones here, and we've got a few minutes left. You're up, sir.
Yeah, my question is the fact that, I think the most interesting aspects of the American Revolution is actually the following policy of the American Revolution. Like Benjamin Franklin, who spent most of his time in London, at least the first time. How is the American Revolution from the point of view of the British internal politics? How did that, the Whigs supported us? The
American Revolution, the prosecution of the counter-insurrection which is what the British were doing for 8 years, was generally very popular in Britain. The British people, by and large, supported King George and his ministers in their attempt to crush the Americans. Only later in the war, 1779, 1780, did that support really begin to erode. Now, there were opponents of the war, and they included some extraordinarily powerful voices like Edmund Burke, one of the great statesmen of the 18th century. But for the most part, people felt that the effort to smash the rebellion was righteous, and in part it was because they bought into the notion that were the Americans to slip away, it'd be the beginning of the end of the empire. Their prosperity depended on keeping essentially vassal states as colonies. And so the king and his men were fundamentally able to keep folks behind them. Thanks for the question. Sir.
Hi. I grew up on the north end of the Jersey Shore, and I was surprised as I read about what happened there that it was a very evenly divided county, Monmouth County, about a third rebel, a third loyalist, a third people hunkering down trying to get through it. And it was a guerrilla war. It was pretty terrible, and I was wondering, is that unique? Were there different regions that were more on one side than the other side?
Yes. Well, loyalism, today when we talk about counterinsurgency theory, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever, we talk about human terrain. Petraeus uses the phrase a lot. The human terrain in the American Revolution is incredibly complicated, in part because there are these divided loyalties. There are those who are really aligned fully with the rebellion. There are those who remain loyal to the king, and there are those, as you say, who are somewhere in the middle or are just trying to hunker down. It was probably about 20% of white America, 2 million people, who were real loyalists, who evinced loyalty in some tangible form. That's not enough, as it turns out, to crush the rebellion. It's also far fewer than the king and his ministers believed. But there were pockets of loyalism that were more substantial in other places. New England tended to be rebellious. There were not a whole lot of loyalists in New England, particularly in Massachusetts. But in Monmouth County, of course, there's a great battle fought in Monmouth, the last major battle in the North in the Revolution. Parts of New York City itself tends to be a loyalist hotbed. The Piedmont of North Carolina, it's full of Scots who have emigrated from the Highlands. They had rebelled against their king several decades before. They had been crushed. Many of their leaders had been executed. They weren't going to make that mistake again. And so loyalism is strong in that part of North Carolina. So there are areas where loyalism is fairly intense. A percentage of the population is higher. The war in the South, which dominates the revolution in the last couple of years, is incredibly bloody and brutal. It anticipates the Civil War, and it's in part because of these conflicting pockets of people who are willing to kill each other, kill their neighbors, rather than to accede to their point of view. It's a nasty thing, the American Revolution, and it's largely because of the reasoning you put your finger on. Sir.
Yeah, thank you for the book, but two things have always, I don't know if your book answers it, two things have always bothered me about the American Revolution, which you sort of mentioned. One thing is, as you mentioned, individual musket fire was very, because of the gunpowder and the muskets, was very ineffective. Yet the mass firing through formations that the English use was very effective. The Americans didn't use that mostly. They weren't trained to do that. But the English were, and they were very effective with the mass firing. The other thing is, in terms of small wars, insurgency, counterinsurgency, the British were very well trained. They had Cromwell and Montrose, Lord Graham. They had Montrose and Cromwell. Montrose.
Yeah,
they were,
I know there's a question in there.
They were. The two questions are: one, the question is, why did the British lose? Okay, they had the mass firing, very effective, and they had training in counterinsurgency. Why did we win? Why did they lose?
Yeah. First of all, we did adopt, at Washington's insistence, because Washington had been trained as a militia colonel under British command in the 7 Years' War. So beginning really at Valley Forge, there's an effort to impose the kind of regimented fire and drill and military cohesion that you describe. It's not just a British thing. The Americans become much better at it. You know, we show on several occasions that we can slug it out with them. You know, the issues of why remind me the second part?
The British were trained in counterinsurgency.
Oh, counterinsurgency. Well, yeah, they'd had some experience in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War here. So they had adopted their tactics to counterinsurgency, but still, you can't say that they're a adroit counterinsurgency force. That's not what they do. We'll take one more question, and then we'll call it a night.
So in your book, you comment about the mistakes that leaders made in selecting terrain. So I wondered if you could comment on map making and topology studies back in that age.
Yeah. Well, the British have excellent maps. The Americans, not so much. The British maps, a lot of which are at Windsor Castle, actually, the ones that were used, and these big maps were sent to the king so that he could study them. They're exquisite. The Americans are slower of course, they're playing on their home turf, so maps are important, but if you know a guy who's lived in this county all his life, that helps to compensate for some of the shortcomings in cartography. Terrain, you know, George Washington was a surveyor, as you know, when he was a young man, and you would think that terrain is his strong suit. He makes several terrible mistakes when it comes to eyeballing the terrain. Long Island, for example, in August of 1776, he just doesn't read the terrain correctly. He doesn't recognize that the forces that have been arrayed to repel the British after they've landed on the western tip of Long Island are very vulnerable to being outflanked around the left end of the American line. Washington looks at it, and he just does not see it. Same thing at Fort Washington, which is three months later. He just does not see it. So trying to understand the nuances of terrain and the importance of terrain in tactical warfare, which is pretty critical when we're talking about the kind of close combat that dominates 18th century warfare, is something where Americans make mistakes frequently. Now, the British also make mistakes despite those fine maps. Sometimes, you know, battles come back to who understands the terrain better than his opponent. And if you can take advantage of the high ground, which is usually superior to the low ground, if you understand the vulnerabilities on your flanks, if in general you are able to anticipate the weaknesses of your enemy's position, then you're in much stronger position to win that battle. And it's going to take a while for the American commanders to really get there. Thank you again so much for coming out this evening. Thank you.